Content warning, this video is going to be talking about some very dark scenarios that are plausible and could happen very soon. So if that kind of stuff triggers anxiety for you, I'd recommend just giving this one a skip or watching when you're in a pretty good headspace. Anyways, let's continue. I'm sure I'm not the only person who has listened to Robert Evans's podcast, It Could Happen Here, which came out in 2018. If you haven't listened to this, then congratulations, you have a new podcast to listen to. Everybody who I recommended it to, one, listened to the entire thing in one day, and two, hated me for showing it to them because three, it gave them nightmares that they couldn't sleep after listening to it. So, enjoy that. Robert Evans is an American journalist who has spent a significant amount of time in Syria covering the Syrian civil war. And he sees through different trends that are happening in America, the breakdown of civil society in general, that there is a road that America is going down leading towards what he fears is a second civil war. And he doesn't take that lightly. Robert Evans is not a person who is extreme in his predictions. He is somebody who has a very firsthand, realistic idea of players and politics and political violence. Now, I'm sure I'm not the only person who has had a conversation with a friend or a family member or someone on the internet about the election coming up in November, if you haven't heard about it. And in this election coming up, there's a possibility there might not be, since the birth of the country, a peaceful transition of power from one president to another. There have been significant fears that Trump, breaking pretty much every norm of American political culture, could result in a very weird situation, because what it turns out is the way that the power of the presidency has grown over the years, that if the president doesn't want to listen to laws or norms or anything, he kind of doesn't have to. And if Trump loses the election in November, there might be the ultimate test of that. And if you're scared about that, you're not alone. There's a pretty big group of bipartisan elites, campaign managers, media people, and even former military officials called the Transition Integrity Project, which is a group that is afraid that Donald Trump will not cede an election even if he loses, and that the transition of power might result in some heavy crimes, ransacking of the government, or possibly even a civil war. And what this group did was a simulation, actually a tabletop game with like actual dice. I hear D10 dice, where they simulated with people who are actually in that position. So like, for example, the Republicans playing in the scenario were actually former Republican politicians. Campaign managers played the campaigns, journalists played journalists, etc., etc. And they tried to game out several different scenarios about how the election might turn out. And I gotta tell you guys, it looks pretty grim. Let's talk about it. Hi, welcome to Tristan Won't Shut Up. I'm your host, according to the comments, Low T Shrek. The Transition Integrity Project started under the fears that Donald Trump will not cede an election even if he loses, and might result to illegal means in order to change the result of an election or to hang on to power even if all the signs say that he lost. Also that he might commit crimes in order to prevent any criminal charges being brought against him after a transition of power. So in June of this year, the Transition Integrity Project hosted a really big event. Over 60 people participated in these games in teams of 3 people to figure out what happened in multiple different election outcome scenarios. They went through 4 scenarios that they thought might lead to Trump doing illegal things in order to try and sway the election, or to try and escape culpability for different types of crimes. And I decided to talk through all 4 of them from the least dark to the most dark. So, you know, if one scenario is a little bit too far for you, then you should probably check out until this time code, until we get to sort of after what happened in the scenarios. So the first outcome was Biden winning a sizable victory, i.e. a comfortable lead in the Electoral College and a pretty comfortable lead in the popular vote. The first thing that the Donald Trump campaign tried to do is allege massive voter fraud, basically accusing illegal immigrants of voting, that mail-in voting was an attempt to undermine the election, etc., etc., etc. He calls for investigations into the election, and the GOP follows along by and large. At the same time, the Donald Trump White House started to try and make away with as much of the government dole as possible in order to secure funds for Donald Trump to be even more wealthy after he comes out. This has a historical precedent. There are several times in which a government's dictator is coming out of power, and as they transition out of power, basically walk away with huge amounts of government money. Meanwhile, the lame duck session of the Senate is very focused on the GOP trying to rush through a lot of the things that hadn't been done during the first Trump administration that they wanted to do to secure as much power and longevity in the political process as possible. One of the notable things about the Trump administration is that there are tons and tons of judicial appointments that have yet to be done, significantly more than other presidents. And so one of the things the GOP would probably be fixated on is trying to push through as many conservative judges into the judiciary as possible. The Trump campaign then attempted to write blanket pardons for himself and everybody associated with the White House in an attempt to legally shield themselves from prosecution for any crimes they might have committed while in the White House. There's a lot of attempts to try and block Biden from having an effective transition of power, which will mean that there's going to be a lot more legwork to do in the early days of the Biden administration in order to sort of get things back to speed. But overall, the lead is comfortable enough that Donald Trump eventually does, while not conceding, does leave power with two major goals. The first one is to set up his son, Donald Trump Jr., although I would probably say it'd be Ivanka Trump, to begin the process towards running for president in 2024. And what has long been suspected, Donald Trump starts MAGA TV, a far-right media channel. So massive corruption, quick attempts to cover up for any crimes, but overall a non-violent transition of power. And this is the best outcome as far as preventing political violence and avoiding civil war. Because I'm not like the weirdos on the internet who just want the map to change in any way whatsoever, no matter how many people die. The second scenario was a narrow Biden win. This is a small lead in the Electoral College and a less than 1% popular vote victory. Now, to discuss this one, we're going to need to talk a little bit about how the presidential election actually works. On election night, the president's not actually decided. What happens is that they choose a bunch of electors. The amount of Electoral College votes that you see that happen in the Electoral College, no matter how broken it is a representation of how many people each state gets to send to Washington, D.C. to have the actual vote for the president. And they're pledged to vote for whoever that is. If they don't, they're called faithless electors. And different states have different rules about what happens when they don't vote along the lines that they were pledged to. Some it's really big, some it's as small as a $1,000 fine, and some there's no punishment at all. In this scenario, what Trump tries to do is go to the governors of states that were very close but have Republican governors and try to convince them to send a separate slate of electors that are friendly to Donald Trump, which means that the state would send more delegates than they're supposed to, basically claiming that he won and that it was, again, massive voter fraud by illegal immigration and mail-in voting and everything like that, that sort of put enough doubt in the air to try and push for his victory. In the scenario, this was done through dice rolls to see how effective it was. And in the scenario, despite the Biden campaign's insistence to not do it, Pennsylvania and Michigan do send a separate set of electors to the Electoral College. The next project that the Trump campaign engaged in was a campaign to try and delegitimize mail-in votes. Because COVID-19, there is a huge push. There's going to be a lot more mail-in votes in this election, and Donald Trump has already been working very hard to try and delegitimize whatever their results will be because they're going to support Biden. Mail-in ballots in general, except in very rural areas, tend to support the Democrats. So Trump goes to friendly media to say that the election's been stolen, that there's massive voter fraud going on, and that the Democrats are trying to do an insurrection and undermine and steal the election from him. Attorney General Barr starts a project to try and halt counting of the mail-in ballots and try to get, in as many states as possible, the mail-in vote discounted. At the same time, the Trump campaign releases a false story that Joe Biden had a heart attack in order to sow doubt in his health and competency in becoming president anyway. In the scenario, the Biden campaign quickly debunks it, but the information still spreads anyway on Facebook, and basically in the conservative counterculture, the conspiracy world, everybody believes that Joe Biden had a heart attack. Despite all this underhanded chaos sowing, all sorts of stuff, the result still comes out with a narrow win for Joe Biden. And that was done with dice rolls. See, what you guys don't know is that over there I have like a huge collection of Dungeons and Dragons books. So the fact that they're using like tabletop rules and like role-playing games to try and suss out what might happen in an election is actually really, really cool. I'll talk about it a little bit later. The Trump campaign realizes soon after the election that on top of trying to delegitimize the results of the election, that they need to create a state of chaos in order to frame Trump himself as a sort of bringer of law and order, and to stop what would be more and more apparent as a Democrat attempt to create an insurrection. More police crackdowns happen on Black Lives Matter protests, and as the election gets more and more disputed, there's gonna be more and more people out in the street basically protesting, and Trump encourages more state violence against these people. There's even open appeals to the alt-right and to the Boogaloo movement to come out into the street to help the president, which if you listen to It Could Happen Here is like top on the list of like that could start the entire thing. The Biden campaign responds by trying to shame the president for such despicable moves and to push for moderate Republicans to try and support his claim to the White House. Mitt Romney helps out and tries to actively appeal to more moderate Republicans to get them on board, but is largely unsuccessful, only really being able to get about 3 of them over. Though as it gets closer to Biden being certified as the winner, Mitch McConnell covertly talks to Republican senators and allows them to acknowledge that Joe Biden is the president-elect. One of the things the Republican Party takes away from this is that they're starting to think that more moderate Republicans might need to be picked or fielded for the 2022 elections. At the same time, the Biden campaign brings out a massive protest movement to try and legitimize his claim to the presidency, because what seems to be happening at this moment in era of chaos and confusion is that popular opinion seems to be based on how things are doing in the streets and how the media is covering different protests. But nonetheless, things being so close and things being so full of chaos, there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of skirmishes, there's a lot of terrorism that happens in the streets. In this setting, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which are the people who run the US military, leak a memo out, basically revealing all the stuff about Donald Trump trying to sow chaos in order to make the election go his way. And so once the House and the Senate both vote to acknowledge the Biden presidency, the military makes it clear that they are going to support Biden as well. As the election starts to slip away from the Trump campaign, far-right media tries to sow more discord in order to literally encourage violence and disrupt the election process. For example, InfoWars releases the names, addresses, and personal information about electors who are pledged to vote for Joe Biden when the electors all come to DC to actually do the vote, saying that many of them are satanic pedophiles, QAnon stuff. Rush Limbaugh accuses Biden of only winning with help of the Chinese government, and this gets picked up by mainstream media and replicated quite a bit. And right-wing Facebook groups, QAnon groups, alt-right groups become more and more militaristic and ready to commit violence. So I would say that in this presidency, there's a huge spike in right-wing terrorism. Eventually, Biden's victory is certified, but Donald Trump refuses to leave the White House. Donald Trump spends the last few months trying to furiously burn documents that show that he tried to sow discord and take the election back his way. He starts to issue blanket pardons for himself and everybody involved, and still goes on the book regularly to say that the election is illegitimate. But because of some lucky rolls, the Secret Service does go with the government and escorts Donald Trump out of the White House on January 20th. Immediately, Donald Trump transitions into making his own TV network and immediately starts using it to attack the legitimacy of the election and attack Joe Biden, and this sort of hovers as a dark cloud over the rest of his presidency. Because it was a narrow victory, Joe Biden tries to create more political unity by incorporating more moderate Republicans into his cabinet and into major appointments to political offices. Originally, the Biden campaign tried to give the Trump campaign a way out, a way to, get out of this without there being any crimes, but because he refuses to leave, the Biden campaign and the Democrats begin to open up an investigation into Donald Trump's tampering with the election results. So that's the second best outcome. After this, we're getting into like legit civil war territory. So like, the third scenario is an ambiguous one. This is one where on election night, there is no clear winner. Something happens, at least something happened in the scenario, that results in a Trump victory, but it's very, very questionable. So originally on election night, because of the mail-in ballot thing I talked about earlier, the results tend to favor Trump, and Trump immediately calls for Biden to concede, without any mail-in ballots being counted, and the election still far from decided, which is very likely to happen this year. In the meantime, Donald Trump tries to mobilize the National Guard in order to secure voting locations, and at the same time, Barr starts to begin an investigation to try and find a way to delegitimize the mail-in votes. Biden responds to this by trying to lead a national call to have every vote be counted. The GOP largely supports Trump's claim to the presidency, but stops short of supporting his use of the National Guard to basically commit martial law to stop the election from going to Biden. In the meantime, Trump continues to try to federalize the National Guard and to convince his supporters to come out into the streets and help protect his win. Joe Biden responds in a very Joe Biden fashion, which is to start a bipartisan committee to ensure the integrity of the vote. As each individual state tries to come up with its answer as everything gets close, parties start to challenge results in different states. Multiple recounts have to happen. It's a big disaster. But many attempts by both parties to try and overturn results with recounts fail. Eventually, everything gets decided, and it all narrows down to Michigan. Basically, Michigan playing the role of Florida in the 2000 election. If you guys don't remember, Florida in the 2000 election was basically the deciding state between whether Gore or Bush was going to win, and through some extremely sketchy stuff that had to do with Jeb Bush, George Bush's brother, being the governor of Florida, sort of pushing through voter suppression and not counting votes on very dubious grounds, that resulted in George Bush eventually being declared the winner by the Supreme Court, despite a little bit later it turning out that, Gore actually won. Michigan eventually goes to Trump, but it's only because a radical Trump supporter burns a box of ballots that he thought were Biden trying to steal the election from Trump. It's highly believed that this box of mail-in ballots were siding with Biden, and even though it's called, Michigan, seeing the ambiguity, sends a second set of electors, kind of like in the previous scenario, that is pro-Biden to the Electoral College. Basically, neither campaign accepts the results of the Electoral College. Neither campaign recognizes the election's results and claims that they are the rightful victors of the presidency. Both sides call for supporters to come out into the streets and support their claim to the presidency. In this hugely chaotic, competing protests, violence in the street situation, Donald Trump invokes the Insurrection Act and mobilizes the National Guard to suppress pro-Biden protesters. January 20th comes, and both sides claim the presidency, and no one actually knows who is going to get access to the White House and the nuclear codes. What you see at that point? Civil war. Now, they don't say civil war in this scenario, but sounds a lot like the conditions that lead to a civil war. Now, the last scenario is the darkest scenario. Real bad stuff happens. America fundamentally changes. This is the scenario where Trump wins the Electoral College, but again, doesn't win the popular vote. Again. Just like 2016. In this scenario, Donald Trump claims victory and tries to immediately delegitimize the popular vote victory of Joe Biden. This victory in the Electoral College without the popular vote brings out massive protesters who want, the popular vote winner to be the winner. And Donald Trump uses agent provocateurs, which, if you don't know who those are, that is when police officers embed police officers within protests and get them to break windows or do violence in order for the police to justify using riot control and violent attacks to suppress the freedom of speech and the right to protest if anybody's protesting. It's happened multiple times. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's literally been confirmed. Donald Trump uses the agent provocateurs to try and make the claim that this is a violent insurrection to try and unseat the rightfully elected president of the United States. Under the guise of trying to take down the deep state, he tries to consolidate power, and this involves using the National Guard and the military to essentially try and remove all barriers to him being able to push through his agenda. He has expressed multiple times frustration with the roadblocks to his absolute power, and if he got reelected, he would probably see that as enough of a mandate to ram down any attempts to control his authority. This includes a lot of military appointments and military promotions that are, quote, pro-American. In this situation, the GOP actually supports Donald Trump's violent crackdown on protests. His narrative is that he is the unifier who's trying to put down insurrectionists and anarchists who are bringing chaos and disorder to the United States. Though the Republicans do try to push Donald Trump to stop these more overt attempts to grab power and to violently suppress any resistance to his rule. In a big moment in this scenario, the Joe Biden campaign rescinds their concession, even though they did lose the Electoral College, claiming that this is the third election in 20 years that the Electoral College picked the president over the will of the people, and that the person who wins the popular vote should be the one who becomes president, citing massive voter suppression that happened due to the not counting of mail-in ballots. The Biden campaign asks for recounts in 3 states. All 3 of them happen. 2 of the states send a separate set of electors that are in favor of Joe Biden. And the GOP tries to convince moderate Democrats to accept the Trump victory, but they don't. In this scenario, what's described is basically a constitutional crisis. There is widespread chaos, 2 claimants for the presidency, widespread political violence in the streets, and the general media ecosystem is extremely uninformative and highly partisan. Then there's one part which gets a little ridiculous, and honestly, in this scenario, the Joe Biden campaign has way more of a backbone than I think they would in the real world. But in this scenario, Joe Biden gets the governors of California, Oregon, and Washington to threaten to secede from the United States unless some serious changes are made to the Electoral College and the electoral process. The things that Joe Biden demands under advisement from Obama are actually things that Democrats should be trying to do anyway. These are things that would help them quite a bit to ensure majority rule and also to help the Democrats in government. The first being statehood for Puerto Rico and DC. The second being splitting California into 5 different states because California is very poorly represented in the Electoral College. There's a mandatory retirement for Supreme Court justices at 70. And of course, the elimination of the Electoral College and allowing the popular vote to be the winner of the election. And in order to try and drive a wedge in the Democratic coalition, Donald Trump, I swear to God, this is one of the weirdest things, gives an interview to The Intercept in which he states that he would have lost the election if Sanders was the nominee. Which, okay, sure, bud. But the Trump strategy is essentially to try and force the Biden campaign to do more and more extreme things to make their claim of victory so that Donald Trump can be seen as the defender of the United States against an insurrectionary Democratic Party. He basically at this point calls it a coup. Working with a lot of top CEOs, he has this big unity event at the Lincoln Memorial where he tries to call for everyone to come together, which is basically an attempt to make the Democrats look ridiculous. What happens in the actual vote for the election is that the Biden campaign is able to convince the House to say that Biden was the victor, while the Senate, and Mike Pence working the Senate, is able to make them claim that Trump is the victor. And what happens is January 20th happens, and there are 2 claims to the presidency. Nobody has a legal claim on the presidency, and no one knows what to do. Again, civil war. They didn't say civil war. Whenever civil war is said, that's just me saying it. So the insights that the Transition Integrity Project came up with through this scenario is that contesting the election is going to be highly politicized, that being able to mobilize people in the streets is going to be a big indicator for the popular opinion on who is the legitimate claimant to the presidency, and that a close election is going to be very, very chaotic. And so they recommended that state governments and politicians and media figures should prepare for an extremely drawn-out, contested, rough election. That state government should not listen to the presidency, not be bullied, and should focus on getting a good and accurate vote and make sure that every vote is counted, including mail-in ballots, which there are no issues with fraud associated with. That getting it right is one of the biggest things to avoid a crisis during the election. Now, the two big issues are going to be the Trump campaign attacking the integrity of the election and violence in the streets. And then that got me thinking, what does post-Trump look like? Say we got the best scenario, clear Biden win, Donald Trump out of the White House. What does this look like? What does 2021 American politics look like? It's almost certain that Donald Trump's going to start a media organization. He's going to start Trump TV. He was pretty much ready to do so after the 2016 election when he assumed he was going to lose, and it's pretty likely that that's going to be the next thing. His main thing you've been seeing is criticizing media platforms. Even actually, just a few hours before I recorded this video, called Fox News fake news. So now he's too far to the right for Fox, I guess, and now he's gonna have to start his own media network, which is gonna be oofa doofa. I have a lot of concerns what's gonna happen with the newly mobilized far right, with the Boogaloo movement, with the alt-right, with the QAnon people. What happens with all of them? I see a big increase in right-wing terrorism and possible insurrectionary movements coming in the new year if Biden is elected, which, sad to say, is actually preferable to Trump winning. And even if Trump is taken out of office, we're not done with him. He will be a factor in American politics for years to come. Probably forever. Even after he dies, whatever media legacy he sets up will be part of the process. He has made his mark on American history, and there's no real taking that back at this point. And I just want to mention that I also had a nightmare once about Trump losing this election, but then pulling a Grover Cleveland and winning election in 2024 after spending 4 years delegitimizing the Biden presidency, and Biden making no friends by being a really, really shitty president, which I think we're all expecting. Other things I want to say is that this simulation was actually really valuable. I thought this was a really, really good way to try and figure out different scenarios, and that simulations and role-playing games and like scenario planning like this is, first of all, really cool. Second of all, as a TTRPG nerd, awesome. 3, the fact that the dice are involved, which means that adds elements of chaos and response, and that the game was designed to be very free-form role-playing, which meant that they were given a lot of leeway to do what they wanted to do, and dice were just used to try and figure out whether or not things were successful. I thought that was very good. I really didn't think that it would be a good idea if, like, you know, you had to deal with, like, Joe Biden's charisma score or something weird like that. But I do think that there's a lot of value in this. I think that what these scenarios played out was that, yeah, there's gonna be a lot of chaos, but there's some unexpected things that come out of this. Like second electors. That is going to be an interesting issue if that comes up. There's 2 scenarios here in which there is no actual declared president, which is, that's a lot. And so what this says to me is that we are very likely to see an election that ends in chaos and violence. Kind of perfect end of 2020. It's just whether it's, you know, regular amounts of chaos or like a second American Civil War, that's still up in the air. And I would say something comforting to say that won't happen, but I can't. I have a bit of an anxiety disorder, and I am legitimately terrified about this. After reading this document, I had trouble sleeping over it. We should all be very scared about what happens next. I don't know what else to say to that. There are very few scenarios, and looking at polls, less scenarios, in which the outcome of this election isn't extremely bad for a lot of innocent people. And those are the people I think about the most. In the United States, even if you don't know anybody who's there, even if you don't care about humanity, which I know some people do, the United States is the largest producer of food in the world, and that any major disruptions like a civil war to the US economy would result in global food crisis. As well, the United States has an extremely well-stocked nuclear stockpile. Who has access to those in a situation where there are two claimants on the presidency could be a very dangerous situation. And if Donald Trump is desperate to cling to power, it looks like he's losing, and America's turned into basically like Syria of a couple years ago, I don't know what comes after that. And the real scary part is no one does. Well, that was cheery. This is a brand new channel, so I'd really love it if you subscribed. I would also like to thank my patrons for making this channel possible. If you want to go patreon.com/stepbackhistory and help out, you obviously can. Until next week, ciao.